Well, let's continue the discussion now with Perrin Beatty, the President and the CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Beatty, good to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you and your organization are really expressing some serious reservations about this legislation, so much so that you say it undermines collective bargaining. How does it do that?
What the government is doing is it's very firmly putting its thumb on the scales in favor of the unions and saying to them that there's not a big price to be paid for causing a strike. By doing that, what they're doing is to disrupt a very carefully constructed balance that Parliament has worked on over the course of literally decades to ensure that there's an incentive for both business and for labor to come together and negotiate agreements at the negotiating table.
And you also add to that the legislation, and this is from the statement that you released, that the legislation undercuts Canada's ability to act as a dependable trading partner. How does it do that?
What you could have is even a small bargaining unit that is part of a supply chain, putting down the whole supply chain because of the inability to have replacement workers. When that happens, our customers around the world look at Canada and they say, we can't count on Canada to be able to keep the commitments it made in terms of supplying us as their customer.
Okay. But, Labor, of course, argues that replacement workers create unfair conditions for companies. It gives them unfair bargaining influences, is what essentially they say, because corporate entities have deeper pockets. They can wait out workers by bringing in non-union employees. What do you say to that?
Well, I think the key point here is that over the course literally of decades, through intensive work on the part of government, others who've studied it, negotiations between business and labor, we've established a balance that allows workers to go on strike, unions to go on strike, allows companies to use replacement workers where it's necessary to do so. And it creates an incentive for both sides to negotiate as opposed to having a work disruption. What the government is doing now is they're saying they will help one side, one of the parties, hold a gun to the head of the other, that the other will either capitulate or they will be simply ground down as a result of a labor stoppage, which will prevent them from doing any work whatsoever. And that's something which is damaging to not simply to the collective bargaining process, but is damaging to Canadian families right across the country and to Canadian businesses.
Do you understand the concern, though, regarding not bringing in replacement workers because it creates a disadvantage for labor? Do you understand that argument, or what do you say to it?
Well, inevitably, either of the parties is going to be arguing, well, we'd like to skew things in our direction. What Parliament has done up until now is to work very carefully to make sure that it wasn't skewed one way or the other, that there was, in fact, an incentive on both sides to be able to encourage them to go back to the bargaining table. And most importantly, the role of government isn't to weigh in on behalf of one of the sides in the labor dispute. It's to protect the public interest. And what we're going to be finding here is more labor disputes, longer strikes. We'll be finding that it's inflationary in its nature, that it costs jobs where, for example, people have to move their goods to market, can't do it. That company may be forced to lay people off, so that the effects of this will spill right through the economy. It will mean that Canadian families won't be able to get services that they've come to depend on a daily basis. At some point, the government has to look at where does the public interest lie here, as opposed to where can I create political favor with one party or another.
So where does that leave you then? Because here you have this piece of legislation tabled today, supported by the Liberals and New Democrats, enough to get it passed in the House. Where does that leave you and the concerns being expressed by your organization?
Well, the thing that's so distressing is that the government is simply disregarding the public interest and feels that there's a political advantage for it, particularly in the relationship that it has with the NDP at the present time, to bring forward legislation that will be costly to Canadians and will be disruptive for the collective bargaining process. What's going to be important is for those of us who think the public interest should come first, for us to take the message to the Canadian people, to help them to understand what's at stake here and what's being lost.
So your hope is that there might still be a chance that this does not pass?
At the end of the day, governments are accountable to the people who elect them. And if Canadians stand up and they say, look, enough of this, let's stop playing games, let's put the interests of Canada as a whole ahead of everything else, perhaps the government can be persuaded to reconsider. And that's what's critical at this point. We have had so many labor disruptions this year, and we have so many pressures on supply chains, and we have so many hits that our economy has taken, that for the government to consciously choose to inflict more on the Canadian economy and on the Canadian people just makes no sense whatsoever.
Perrin Beatty, always appreciate the time. Thank you for that tonight.
Thank you for having me.